So I think we're ready to run this web page now. To run the web page, you just simply invoke debug, start without debugging. Later on, we'll run the application in the debugger, but not yet. Let's just run it for now as start without debugging. Now, an interesting thing happens when we do this. Let me click that menu item. And can you notice the bubble at the bottom of the page? It shows that ASP.NET has automatically started up. Visual Studio has automatically invoked its own development web server purely to host my web application. This explains why I don't need to have IIS installed on my development computer. When you run the web page within Visual Studio, it automatically creates its own cut-down version of a web server to host your web page. This is a new feature in ASP.NET 2.0. So, in my web page, let's enter a name. I'll enter my name in here. My full name is Andrew Carl Olsen, but only my mother calls me that these days. If I click the button, well, nothing seems to have happened, but actually something did happen. When I clicked the button, the browser submitted my name to the web server. At the web server, ASP.NET received the text I'd entered, Andrew Carl Olsen, but it didn't actually do anything with the data. It just simply returned the same HTML page back to me again. What I was rather hoping was to display the results in the text box here. So to do that, we need to add some logic to our ASP.NET page. We need to add an event handler to process the click event on this button, such that when the button is clicked, my web application retrieves the text from the text box and, for example, displays that text in this label here. So that's what we're going to do next. So let's close this window here, Alt F4, and think about what we need to do to achieve that effect. So if we take a look at the web page in the designer, every control in an ASP.NET web page, such as text boxes and buttons, for example, all of these controls are capable of generating events. Events are handled in the code behind file for your web page. So, for example, this page here is default.aspx. What we need to do to handle these events is to add code to the code behind file, which, as we mentioned earlier, is default.aspx.cs. Now, there are various ways of doing this, and to be quite frank, the details vary between C# and Visual Basic. We're focusing on C# here, so the easiest way to define event handlers in C# is to select the control in the window. So this is the button control that we want to handle events for. If you look in the properties window, you can see, as well as being able to view the properties for the control, you can also view the events. If you click on the lightning bolt here, it shows the various events which that control is capable of generating. Now, if you want to, you can handle any of these events, but in most situations for a button, you simply want to handle the click event. The easiest way to do that is to just double-click on the event name, and this automatically adds a method to the code behind class. So there's quite a lot of detail here for us to consider. First of all, we have a series of using statements at the beginning. These using statements import namespaces that we might want to use in our .NET code. These are standard .NET namespaces defined as part of the ASP.NET class library. The next thing to notice is that what we have here is a class definition. The class usually has the same name as your web page. So, for example, if your web page is called Eric, then the class name will be called Eric. However, the word default is a keyword in some programming languages, such as Visual Basic. Therefore, we have a leading underscore in the class name to avoid any potential difficulties with Visual Basic keywords. Now, this syntax, if you're familiar with C#, you'll understand that this indicates inheritance. It shows that our default class inherits from a built-in class called page, which is part of the system.web.ui namespace. All ASP.NET web pages inherit from the page class. Okay, moving along, we have two methods in this class. The first method is always generated for you. It's obviously empty at the moment, and as you can guess from its name, it handles the page load event. when the web page is loaded, ASP.NET calls this method, and it's actually quite a good place to perform initialization code. So, for example, if you wanted to display database data in your web page, then you could put some code in here to connect to a database, get some data, and then display the data in a grid. That's a typical sort of action that you'd perform in the page load event. And we're going to do that in the next few lessons in this series. But we're not going to do it just yet. We're going to have a look at the submit button click method. This is the event handler. It handles the click event on the submit button, as its name suggests. In this method, I'm simply going to display the text that the user entered. I'm going to display that in the result label at the bottom of the web page. So to do that, I can type the name of the control, result label. The result label is a .NET object. And as you can see from the IntelliSense, it's a label object. It has a text property, which enables me to get or set the text content of that label control on the server. So I can set that text property to something such as hello, and then I'll add whatever text the user entered in the full name text box. So that control was called full name text box, and it also has a text property which enables me to retrieve the value the user entered and display it in my label. So the result label will have its text property set to be hello followed by whatever the user has entered in the text box. Okay, one last thing, you might be wondering, how exactly does this method submit button click, how exactly does that method actually get linked to the button on the ASPX webpage? There's nothing here to suggest any linkage apart from the name, but the name itself could be anything, it's arbitrary, really. To understand what's happening, let's go back to the default.aspx page, and we need to look at the source. So let's click on the source tab at the bottom. Let me just close some of these windows a little bit so we can see what's happening a bit more clearly here. Okay, so if you can find the ASP button control, it has an ID, as we've suggested. It has a run@server attribute. It has a text property called clickMe. And here's the crucial bit. We have a new attribute here called onClick. This handles the click event on the button, and it indicates the name of the method which should handle that event in my code behind class. This mechanism is called automatic event wiring up, and it's enabled because of the page directive. If we whiz back up to the top again, remember we had this auto event wire up equals true attribute in the page directive. This means that all we need to do to define an event handler on a control is to specify an appropriate attribute on our control, such as onClick, specify the name of the method, and then in our code behind class, so let's just go back to the code behind class, we define a method with that name in the code behind class. Now obviously there are certain rules here. If you're familiar with event handling in Windows applications, you'll be quite familiar with the concept of event signatures. When you define an event handler for a method, such as submit button underscore click, you must specify the parameters exactly as required by that control. We'll have a look at how this works in a bit more detail in one of the lessons coming up later. Okay, so let's run the application again and see if it works any better. Start without debugging. I'll enter my wife's full name, actually this time, Jane Olsen, and I'll click the button, and there we go. So that's our first ASP.NET web application. Let me just summarize what's happened there. I entered some text, and when I clicked the button, it sent an HTTP request to the web server. At the web server, it passed the request on to ASP.NET, which is a server-side process, and ASP.NET passed the request onto my web page, default.aspx. So let's take a look at the default.aspx web page and just remind ourselves exactly what's happening.